Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways you can address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is making change stick. It doesn't take long for people to revert to pre-change ways of working once the excitement of go live fades and the project team disbands, if they aren't supported through their transition to new ways of working. And it makes sense because familiarity and comfort of past routines and behaviors are greater motivators than the benefits gained from change. So, how do you ensure that the changes stick so that the organization and its employees realize an initiative's full benefits? And my guest today is Sandeep Aujla. Sandeep, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Phil. It's my pleasure to be here.
Sandeep has over 15 years of organizational development, change, and HR experience. She is currently the Director of Human Resources at the City of Brampton in Ontario. Sandeep is completing her PhD and holds a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology from the University of Guelph and holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from York University. Sandeep, what has been your experience with making change stick?
It's a great question and one that I'm very passionate about because people ask me that all the time. And I have to say, in my experience, before I took on the role as Director of Human Resources, I used to run my own business. And it is at the intersection of HR and change management. So the way my training in industrial organizational psychology has prepared me, it really is looking at the systems view of how do you make anything happen and then make it stick. So it takes some discipline in terms of thinking, but usually if you want to implement a change, usually it's because you want that to be the current state forever, the future going forward. However, in order to make sure that it becomes the new reality, there are so many other pieces that go around it. It's a wraparound approach to make sure that those changes can stick. So one of the funny things that I think you and I have talked about previously in COVID with the mask wearing and how we frequently forget to wear that mask, and we know we need to, it is required. So what the government has done is they didn't just say, COVID is bad news, make sure you wear a mask just to protect yourself. No, they also created bylaws that you cannot be in a public space less than 2 meters apart from each other and not wear a mask. So those rules that the government came forward with that then were adapted by organizations to say what the expectations are before people come into the organization or engage with their patrons. All those pieces help reinforce any individual's commitment that absolutely, I need to wear a mask and I'm going to, but I will forget because I'm not used to keeping that mask on me. But the moment I'm in and I know that even if I'm not wearing a mask, the organization requires me to, so I will go back, I backtrack. So that process of going back and forth, eventually I learn to figure out ways that I keep masks handy and make sure that the change that the organization or the government has imposed on me, I can adhere to, just because that becomes part of the system. So I think it's part of a lot of anytime we're trying to do something different and we need it to last, we start looking at it not just as that behavior, but everything else that wraps around it.
It's such a great example because we're all going through sort of the mask requirement right now. And there has been some press in certain jurisdictions saying that there's confusion over the parts of the system. You know, is it okay, not for the mask necessarily, but for certain rules that have been implemented to make sure that people actually do certain things? How do you in an organizational context make sure that everything lines up? Because you talked about systems thinking, alignment of different elements, but that assumes that everything does line up to the same conclusion for the employee or the citizen.
It is not an easy feat, for sure. Lots of amazing and important stakeholders that enable this vision to happen. Most of the people in an organization would have that intention to make sure that let's ensure safety of one and all. Of course, not everybody has similar circumstances. There are people who can work remotely. So there is a greater level of safety in knowing that you're not engaging with public, you're not outside being exposed to the virus. But then there's so many other jobs that require people to work in that context where they're engaging with public members, they could be exposed to liquids or other things that may put them at a greater risk. So the first lens is, if we continue with our COVID example, the first lens is from that organizational safety perspective, where there are dedicated professionals that have worked their entire lives to ensure what are the best ways to enhance safety so that everybody in the organization is as safe as possible. So it's not that we will stop our firefighters, for example, at the city of Brampton because they're essential workers or are transit drivers who must help people commute and get to their jobs. But what can we do to ensure that they are as safe as possible? So then you start looking at, here are the 4 or 5 things they need to do. The second alignment is actually coming from the government. This is not something the organization is coming up with. There are so many levels of government that are doing research, that have best advisors that are telling them what should be done. So there's alignment with external sources of expertise that you borrow and then make it part of your system. We also, of course, before the government gave clarity, because there was such nebulous information flowing about the masks, most of the cities had to create their own bylaws. Again, a strong, large consultative process to get so many stakeholders to inform what would be the expectations of employees and people in the city of Brampton. When you look at the implementation side of things, an employee gets frustrated given so many directions have changed back and forth. And I think there's a bit of exhaustion that has come from constantly pivoting. There's exhaustion from staying on the ball. One of the most amazing things that our CAO did was started something called a daily CAO email. And it is a composite of the key things you need to know about every single division or department in the corporation. And it takes a concerted effort from our amazing strategic communications team who pulls all the key information from everybody on a daily basis. So it's just so many systems and so many people working together to make sure that, to the best of our ability, we are communicating frequently, we're communicating accurately, and we're communicating comprehensively. The challenge comes when things change and we have to say, great job learning that last thing, but going forward, this is something that has to be done or has to be done differently.
That's a great example of a change that's happening where safety and people's health is an imperative that everyone understands. They realize if they do things well, that it will lead to healthier lives. But a lot of the changes that organizations go through, such as an SAP implementation or a restructure, you don't have that human imperative. It's something more concrete that is just done because it's an objective of the organization. So how does it work when there is something more traditional like that, where the team disbands once they go live and they've had a couple of weeks of good responses and then they moved on? What are the challenges there for making change stick when there's no one really watching that the new ways of working are really being lived?
That is a great question, and definitely one that we all struggle with across our organizations and industries. And I think the secret to making change stick, we're always thinking about the outcome. The secret is actually in the planning before the change gets introduced. So in the SAP implementation example that you're talking about, very, very common occurrence. Usually a core group of experts that are brought on to understand and assess the needs of the system, implement the new system, and then leave. I think if we start thinking from a systems perspective about what are the wraparounds we can put in place to ensure that once the core team has disbanded, that those things becomes the controls and checks that allow for the right behavior to continue on. For example, if we're talking about a new SAP system, what considerations were made from an HR perspective in performance management, such that it's an expectation that every single person in that group will be using the system and how well or optimally they're using it. Now this becomes a control or a lever that I, as a manager, can encourage the person to say, on my quarterly calls or on my mid-year assessment or at the end of the year, to say, this was a very important expectation. And unfortunately, I don't feel that, even though you tried and that's great, but here are some of the things that you could have done to use that system optimally. So that's one example. Another example can be, if we go back with the performance piece, it's a great lever. Not everything can be tied to performance management, but it can be a great lever when you think about performance as both task, which is I will master the system, but also contextual performance, which is my attitude in learning that system and my willingness to pivot as needed. So it's not just what you do, how you do. So when we start framing our expectations to employees, and so many times the unfortunate part is the leader has not, we implement a new system, But we don't explicitly say, oh, that's my expectation. I thought that's common sense, but no. Part of performance management, it starts with clarifying expectation. You know, Phil, you say to me, Sandeep, the new SAP system, it's going to go live. And yes, you are not one of the contributing people in the pilot or decision maker, but going forward, I need to make sure that you and your entire team is using it optimally. What do you need from me? So now it's a shared responsibility between management and employees to make sure that we adopt the system. So that's one example to make sure that thinking that you apply during planning will then positively impact whether that change sticks or not.
One thing you said in one of your great demystifying change videos, which are awesome on YouTube, is you were talking about the mindset, which you just mentioned right now. Could you tell us more about the mindset? Because I do find the change plans are more about the tactical, this is how you fill out the form. How have you been successful focusing on the mindset of adopting the new ways?
Not always successful. I definitely tried. Yes, I try. I think it's an invitation to anyone that is thinking about bringing or disrupting the status quo, which is every dreamer, which is every manager, which is every person who aspires for a better future. When you're thinking about creating change, it's asking what beliefs or values that I hold that are driving the value in this change. So if I want to implement, give me an example. What would you like the world to do more of?
I would say better listening.
So if we want people to listen better, and let's take that in our organizations, one option I have as a manager is to say, in this organization, I want everyone to listen better. The probability of that sticking is going to be very low compared to me reflecting on why does that matter so much? And let me ground it back into our reality. Going back to the healthcare example, when we don't listen as employees in healthcare, patients don't get proper treatment. Patients don't feel respected and valued. And as peers, we feel that our voice doesn't matter or doesn't have influence. These are all things that are counter to anyone who wants to have a positive working experience. So if I am reflecting, when I reflect on what values and beliefs that I hold, which make this an important change for me, an important ask, and I incorporate that when I introduce the idea. So let's say I want to bring it to my team. Two ways I can do this before going to the entire organization, which is thousands of people. Can I think of a select group, some of the key influencers, people that are valued and trusted by their peers, people either because of their position or their personality or someone that others seek out? Those people hopefully have enough disparate opinions and titles, and they come from different departments. You bring that small group of people together or have those one-on-one conversations to understand, why would it matter? Would it be a better world? What are the problems that currently exist when people don't listen? And do they believe that is a problem? And what do they think can be done to change it? That wisdom comes from their beliefs and values. So now you're beginning to understand what mindset in general, elaborating from those few, exists in the corporation. And these are the movers and shakers. So they most likely are people that have huge self-efficacy and influence in the organization, the language that they have used, the rationale that they have provided, and the values that they are talking about, using that as the launching pad to bring it to the broader masses to say, here are some things that we have heard. Because the challenge is when leaders just go out and say, I think this is a great idea. Yes, as you can imagine, Phil, it's like, well, that's too bad. That's your idea. Okay, thank you very much. But one positive step is when leaders says, I've been reflecting. Here are the things that are negatively impacting our business. Here is why it is counter to the goals that we have for the organization. And that's why I think this should be done. But a better leader takes it one step forward to say, not only have I thought about it, I have looked and sought for counsel from people across the corporation, a sampling. And these are the things that I have learned by listening to them. So now I am role modeling the exact behavior I want them to learn. I also create greater trust in why I'm recommending this, because now it is based on shared wisdom. And last, hopefully it resonates with them more because it is grounded not just in the outcome, which is the behavior, but in the beliefs and values that guide why I'm making the ask and why will it make a difference. So I think the thinking makes a big difference and it changes the actions you end up taking.
No, certainly. And such a great example of how co-creation is so foundational to successful change. And would you also have co-creation in even how do we ensure that we listen better once our program is over? Like, is there a role for co-creation in everything, even after care, to make sure that it's embedded into an organization?
That's a really difficult and great question. I think it requires highly empowered organizations and culture. The example that I was using previously about COVID, I think I forgot one of the star players who is a master at co-creation at the City of Brampton, and it's our fire and emergency team. And that leadership team is responsible for making sure there's business continuity and emergency preparedness. But they don't say, we are the experts, we will decide. No, they have constantly from day one been inviting all the stakeholders, bringing them together, enabling those conversations to happen while never overpowering to say, we are the expert, we know. So I think individuals, teams, and leaders absolutely can create those cultures by role modeling that behavior. It's not easy. You know how at the beginning you were saying, I'm sure, Sandeep, you're really busy. And I admitted, yes, it's like running from one meeting to another. It takes such commitment and requires a mindset to know that if I don't co-create, if I don't invest for that conversation and shared space, the changes I'm working so hard to create will not last because people did not invest into creating that future.
So true. And one of the challenges I think that you've highlighted too is it takes so much energy to do it well. But for most of the large changes I've worked on, you get started and you're already behind. It's, can you show me the change plan in 3 days? But we don't know what is changing. And there's this machine that is trying to give it an impression of having a perfect solution way too soon. How do you fight that natural generation of activity that will keep us away from bringing people in and having that change collective to come up with the mindsets that are required? How do you fight the wave of activity?
It's so poignant you ask that because I think we all need to ask ourselves that. And I don't want to just hold a job. I want to make sure that that job has impact, which means that the goals that I have in terms of how that work will be done and the attitude that I bring to the job, it's not always aligned with the busyness of the job. And it takes conscious reflection. It also takes some sticky notes at my desk to remember what matters most. It also is a shared commitment that I have shared with my core HR leadership team. So we hold each other accountable. If there is a lot of rush, we do have a created safe space where every Monday morning we have a huddle with a large group, not everybody in HR, but some of the key advisors, senior advisors, the leadership team, to just align on what is the most important thing. But there are also spaces we have created, or we try as much as possible to create those spaces where you force yourself to break from that monotony of activity. It's again the system thinking. I swear that thing is grounded in making sure that we all don't just run on autopilot. We have to put those checks and balances in place. And then, of course, there's family and the dog. There are also wonderful controls that say, by the way, it's 6 o'clock. It's time for a walk. So I think, jokes apart, being strategic will take effort.
How do you make sure we keep measuring once something is done so that we can even see what benefits that we receive from the change?
It's a little complex in the sense that the measurement itself changes. So for example, what I'm measuring for while implementing the change versus what I look for after the change has been implemented for about, let's say, 6 months or a year, versus what metrics I'm looking at after it's institutionalized in the culture are very different. Have there been things that fall off the radar? Absolutely. But I think one of the systems that have worked really well for me is when we look at what strategic priorities a certain group has. And this is primarily from an HR lens, because that's where a lot of my focus has been when it comes to strategy. And any strategy or strategic plan, once finalized, whatever the initiatives are, measurement is a key part of that. And I frequently talk about HR metrics and analytics. Having something digestible, so as a dashboard, that is something that you have a fixed commitment on to review on a monthly basis and report on in terms of a narrative or story, it becomes a check. Somebody in the team is responsible. And ideally, one of my things that I'm working very hard towards is to make sure that no single person is a project manager on more than one initiative. And I know it's not always possible for small or medium-sized organizations, but at least in the large organizations, it creates a fantastic opportunity to have a large number of people get that development opportunity while not increasing workload for people. And at the same time, it gives them an opportunity to make sure that they take accountability to report back. But what you're getting at, depending on what is the level of leadership that is providing the oversight, you need that overview, the very high level insight into how are things going. Color codes, as I have judged them in the past, I promise you, but I'm learning that it is okay. It's important for me if I only have 15 minutes to review how things are going, I'd rather take those 15 minutes and skim through my 20 initiatives that are being run in the corporation from an HR perspective and focus on what is red. But at the same time, if something was done 2 years ago, we're most likely not talking about it unless it's a problem. But if something was done 6 months ago, our metric better change. Our metric is no longer about, what proportion has been completed or implemented, the training sessions completed. No, the metric now needs to be optimal utilization, and you need to figure out how will you determine that. So if you're not asking or checking for the right metric, you don't understand if it's ready, if the change is no longer a change, it has become part of the culture. So I think that thoughtfulness to measurement is very important. And change managers and any leader working on an initiative will be better suited if they use the right metric, because after 6 months, now the focus is about institutionalization, reinforcement, and any corrective measures as compared to the metrics earlier.
No, great example. And I love your focus on simplicity and pragmatism versus 18 measures.
Yes, please.
We'll get back to you in 2 weeks once we calculate it using AI, and it just becomes too heavy to use. Have you ever found that where, yes, it's really clear what the behavior is required, what compliance is, but when it comes to reviewing or it comes to rewarding people for doing it and actually, sanctioning people for not, it doesn't happen. Has that been your experience as well?
No, that is true. But I think it really is a partnership between the leader that has implemented the new system and the one that is going to help you hold the person accountable. So going back to your SAP example, it's most likely not the chief of staff from the physician group that implemented the system. He or she was probably just a stakeholder. Yet the expectation is that the chief of staff is now going to hold physicians accountable for implementation or a utilization of that system. So that conversation between the two is very important, because if I am the dreamer in terms of I believe in this system, I think it's a game changer, I come to you, Phil, who is the chief of staff leading all the physicians, and I'm not a physician, and I only treat you as a stakeholder where there are checks of here is what stage I'm at, here are the things that need to be done. So it really is about compliance, that did you do this? Did you do this? Okay. As compared to me asking and understanding or listening to you, but what is reasonable in terms of why would a physician use the system? When would they not use the system? How can you actually hold them accountable? The number of changes that I have been part of where, unfortunately, the reality is nobody wanted to hold the end user accountable for using the system. And it's a really tough situation for leaders, because I have seen a lot of change apathy in groups that they have said to me, well, I understand this is important to you, but we have 20 other things that are changing. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to be responsible, or you can't hold me accountable for it. And I think that's where these stakeholder conversations need to escalate. That's where the sponsors come in. So if you think about it, usually the direction is you should have a change sponsor at the senior leadership team. However, the senior leader will probably know that there are hundreds of changes that are coming down the pipeline. Each senior leader, let's say, is responsible for 10, but the end user, the frontline staff, is experiencing 100. So if we go back and borrow from our simplicity and pragmatism, and we look at this as a system, we cannot expect that they will learn and be optimal using all 100 new ways of doing things. So let's get agreement at that level to say 100 things have to change because maybe some versions need to be updated, there are legislative changes. So not that they're not warranted, but what will we hold our organization accountable for? So compliance should not be driven by, here is everything that needs to be taken a look at. In my opinion, I'm sure there are compliance experts that feel differently, but compliance and measurement from an organizational change perspective needs to be looked at. Here are the 3 or 4 or 10 things that matter the most to the organization, such that if a critical mass were doing these things well, then it's a success for the organization. Otherwise, it's not, in my opinion, I don't think it is possible to manage it, to hold people accountable, and to create that lasting change. It's confusing.
No, certainly. No, such a great example. And I do think that's true as well, that if you don't look at the sort of the portfolio or the all of the changes in totality, how can you define priorities for employees or volunteers or whomever? How do you promote that for happening? Because it makes logical sense, but so many organizations don't look at the whole organization. They take a functional approach, so it's HR versus IT versus, how do you break that mold?
I have seen relationships are the greatest magic sauce. Relationship with people that report to me, relationship with my peers who are leaders at the same level, relationship with my senior leader who is going to be my champion at the top. Those relationships allow us to not get into competition. It's not about whether your project is more important than mine, but it's looking at, okay, if here are the, as we said, 100 things, God forbid, there are actually 100 things, but here are the 100 things that are happening across the corporation. Can we understand and agree why it is so important that you have two and I have none that end up on that final dashboard that matters to the organization? That's okay, because I think it's our mindset, again, going back to why each individual is contributing to whether change sticks or not. It's my mindset to know that work that is being done, from my perspective in this example, that it still is enabling success for the organization. It doesn't mean that if it's not making it to the dashboard that it's not important. Absolutely not.
Given we don't always have so much time to implement change and to do everything that we know that's correct to make it work. And let's say you were thrown into a situation where you needed to design or make change stick. What's the one thing that you would do that you would think, hey, it's an 80-20 proposition. If I do this one thing and I do it well, then it will get me 80% of the results and 20% of the time. And there's no perfect, but this is my only option. Given all your experience, what would you do related to making change stick?
The number one goal for me, and I would say 80% of the time that would be my go-to solution, is finding ways to reduce the cognitive burden for the person. If I'm trying to change something, whether it is a behavior, a process, policy, system, it requires mental effort. And as you premise the question by saying we're all so busy, we don't have the energy or time or patience to want to learn, to stop and slow down our thinking, to learn something new. So if I can figure out a way to make it part of the system, part of your environment, to make it an automatic choice, to make it a default, such that that's exactly what you were thinking. Like, why would you choose anything else? Because this is the only system that is available, So if I can automatize that option such that the behavior, system, policy, process, whatever the change may be, becomes the default, then we would have succeeded in allowing people to adopt that change and optimally use that change. It's not always easy. It requires a lot of creative thinking. And I think leveraging the intelligence of the group and definitely our creative thinkers in the group, that can go a very long way.
Just as we round off the show, is there a tip or a watch out or something to remember, or maybe something to highlight from our conversation that you think is absolutely essential when making change stick? Anything for our listeners?
I'll just repeat one of the things that I've shared repeatedly, but I think it is so important if you can give yourself a little more time to think and process before you jump into change. The planning and the investment in that phase will go such a long way in making sure that the outcome is exactly what you want. So if you want change to stick, give greater consideration to planning of how you will make it automatic or the default choice for people to adopt that behavior, policy, process, or programs.
Beautiful. Thank you. I love the default choice. What a great way of phrasing it. Thanks so much for being on the show. I really appreciate your perspectives. How can people get in contact with you?
I am happy as much as possible to connect and to help and learn from others. I would say LinkedIn and Twitter are the go-to formats. LinkedIn more for conversation, Twitter just to follow each other and learn from each other, because I don't think it's really the platform where a lot of conversations happen privately, but LinkedIn would be a great choice.
Great. Thank you. And I really am a big fan of your YouTube videos. So thanks so much for sharing them. They're just outstanding. So thanks so much.
You're very kind, Phil. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for being on the show. And I'd also like to thank our producer, Charlie Buckley. And thanks you for listening. And to check out the just released Change on the Run book, go to changeontherun.com. And until the next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.